Just to kick us off, a little bit about Luminar. If you're not familiar with Luminar, we offer a range of capabilities that help organizations both prepare and respond to critical events. So one of the things that we're most known for around the world is our microsimulation capability, which is essentially bite-sized 25 to 30-minute exercises that help you scale and democratize preparedness across your organization. So anything from compliance training to third-party assessment to really preparing your organization for the key risks that we all need to know how to respond to. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are pretty agnostic of what we do here at Luminar. So it's really about understanding the trends just generally that are shaping both learning and risk management, and how the two are coming together alongside all the advancements that we're seeing in technology. We have about 5 topics today. We're going to talk a little bit about scenario thinking. Just to kick off, we're going to explore a little bit in the way of microlearning and why that's advantageous as opposed to more traditional kind of learning formats, why this is becoming pretty appealing to organizations that are rolling out different sorts of learning programs. We're going to talk a little bit about how to effectively democratize that across the organization to better enable adaptivity, because we all know that sometimes it's not necessarily about avoiding the disruptions. Some of these disruptions cannot be avoided, but how do we recover? How do we adapt in the face of uncertainty? And then to close the session, we're gonna focus a little bit more on artificial intelligence. We're going to talk about the move away from or move in tandem with more assisted AI to something that's being called agentic AI, and then what that means for risk management. And we're going to finish with a quiz. Actually, we're going to go through a challenge here, some headlines, just understanding kind of how do humans and AI stack, and where you can leverage human capability today and where you can leverage AI to really complement what we're great at. So with that, scenario thinking, I wanted to get everyone's sense on what does scenario thinking mean to you? I think this is something that we're seeing a lot more organizations really embrace, a lot more individuals embrace as we see maybe even like the unthinkable happen, how we might better prepare ourselves for some of those sorts of things. What does that mean to you? Future, relevant, current, absolutely. Projections, uncertainty, spectrum. It's interesting. I was talking to a risk leader several years ago. This was right around the time of COVID. And she was reflecting, this was in a university setting. She was reflecting that it used to be that, she'd have kind of a register of top risks. And from year to year, they really didn't change all that much, right? They just never really vacillated all that much. And I think, with the advent of COVID and then the downstream impacts of COVID and everything that we've seen subsequently, we can't count on having a static picture of risk. And I think what you're saying here in terms of scenario thinking, looking at, plausible scenarios that could happen, making those things much more accessible to people. Like we're all buried in our day-to-day jobs and the things that we need to get done today, but how do we really put that in front of people so that they consider, the probable impacts if something were to happen? Really considering, I love this word, spectrum, developing a forecast. Tabletops, I think, is another one. There's a continuum of capability that we use to deliver scenario thinking, whether it be bite-sized exercises or whether it be something more elaborate in the form of a simulation or a tabletop exercise, really putting people through the paces of not just asking people, what would you do, but actually having them do it and apply that learning. So that is fantastic. Thank you for participating in our little poll. And there's gonna be more to come on that. So this was a slide we actually covered in our last webinar that went over risk trends. And one of the things I love about this research out at BCG is it pinpoints the fact that leadership teams and boards are getting much more engaged in these emerging risk areas, right? And I think there's a massive opportunity for whether you're a security team, risk team, resilience team, compliance team, to really build a more effective bridge with leadership around these key topics. And the ones that they pulled off, of course, that are aligned to this particular study are topics such as sustainability and climate risk, generative AI, trade and geopolitics, but I think this could be applied to any number of topics. Clearly, risk is top of mind for executives and boards. And so one of the ways in which they're looking at applying this, and this was a study from last year, they found that, just about half of boards were looking at doing more effective scenario planning and scenario testing. More organizations are doing their strategic planning in shorter cycles. So instead of doing the yearly plan, they might be doing 6-month plan. You could argue that maybe we need to bring that in even further, make it more about the 3-month plan or maybe the monthly plan. But the idea here being really leveraging scenarios to unpack and understand the things that are happening around us. And of course, the beauty of, I know I'm preaching to the choir to some extent, but the beauty of scenarios is really that it allows us to bring it to life in a way that is accessible, in a way that is believable, in a way that is consistent with as you would experience the event as if it was happening. So making that a habit, making that a part of BAU is something that more and more, not just, crisis teams on the ground, resilience teams on the ground, but also leadership teams. How do you get into the habit of thinking about potential futures, right? And planning for those various scenarios. This is a model that many of those organizations are using. So I call this 6 steps to 6 futures scenario planning, but effectively breaking down how you might look at severe and plausible scenarios, with leadership teams. And one of the things that I really love about this model, as it's applied to boards and executives, is really thinking through categorically, not just the trends and the driving forces that are shaping our world today, but then looking at that through a myriad of lenses, right? I think like we all have our tendencies in terms of positivity bias, or some of us maybe lean more toward worst case scenario. Thinking, I know I tend to gravitate in that way, hence I'm working in resilience. But one of the things that I really love about this model that many teams have applied is really breaking it down in terms of 6 discrete potential futures. So one being business as usual. What if things continue in the next 6 months as they are today? What is the plan? What is the absolute best case scenario? How can we best maximize that potential scenario? What's the worst case that could happen? And what do we need to get ready to respond to that? What are some potential surprises that could come our way? The kind of the low probability, high impact sorts of events, that the wild cards. And it's not necessarily always about planning for the specific wild card, but it's really getting your team more practiced in the habits of agility. For an increasing number of industries, it might be looking at what happens in a highly regulated scenario. And then I think all of us are experiencing, well, what happens in a world that is increasingly technology driven and changes some of the fundamental assumptions that we've had around how we operate as businesses, how we deliver services, even the fundamental rules of operating within society, and what does that mean for our organization, both short term and downstream. So tools like this can really help you more effectively engage at the strategic level, as opposed to maybe more of the downstream kind of event-driven sorts of discussions, with your team. But the reality is boards and executive teams need additional support in exploring these futures, these scenarios, and really leveraging the tool set that we have in risk and resilience and security, really empowers and enables those teams differently, and allows us to build a more effective bridge with our leadership team. So that is trend 1. Trend 2 is more about the advantages of microlearning. And I'm going to pop back in and do another quick poll. If you just answer, are you using microlearning? And so maybe it would help for me to define what microlearning, in the context of this discussion, is really breaking down instruction or breaking down training in the form of bite-sized pieces. So that could be, small videos, it could even be, like a handout or a one pager. It could be even for, in some cases, it could be like an email, anything that's really broken down to help people digest things in a much smaller way. So it looks like we have quite a few people that have already started using microlearning. Microlearning has been around for quite some time. As at Wiley, we serve the graduate and postgraduate education programs at universities like Georgetown and UT Texas and the like. And one of the things that we found in our research there and the work that we did with university teams is that engagement, as we all know, is just really very difficult. We're all competing for attention, right? The myriad of things that people have on their plate at work or outside of work, and so finding ways to insert learning opportunities inside of BAU helps in a variety of ways. Making microlearning could also present a number of opportunities to really gamify and better structure learning in such a way that it becomes much more iterative. So you have a sense on kind of where the learner is in their journey on a particular skill or capability. So you can right size your instruction to kind of where they're at. And so a few interesting stats on what we're seeing, a few things that we're seeing in terms of microlearning and some of the supporting research on microlearning that's inclusive of microsimulations, but not necessarily, as we just went through. It may be things as simple as putting detail in an email, kind of could be more of a campaign that you're running internally, just kind of giving people bite-sized information as you go and bringing them along the journey. But 72% of organizations plan to increase their use of microlearning. This was a survey that was just taken a few years ago. 98% of those that have already implemented it intend to continue using it in their training programs. So why is that? There's some supporting stats here around kind of a myriad of factors, cost being one. I think that's important for us to consider, especially as we work with our organizations and becoming much more efficient, ensuring that we have the proper return on investment in the work that we put into our training programs. But one, microlearning reduces the cognitive load for people that are upskilling or reskilling because it's not as cumbersome to undertake it. It's easier for them to access. It's much more accessible. They can fit it in their schedule, one time permit. It also, as I said, the attention span that being, is a big factor with a variety of populations, not just with younger learners, but breaking this down into bite-sized chunks into simpler concepts that are essentially stackable. A great way to ensure that your learners are really getting the benefit out of the time that they spend in training. Increased retention. So learners retain about 80% of information, according to some studies by the National Training Laboratories. This is compared to 20 to 30% when you're using traditional methods. Better engagement. Microlearning boosts engagement rates by up to 50%. Obviously it depends on how you deploy this. You could deploy microlearning in a way that's also very, static and like not engaging. But the fact that it's, quick hits, short, sharp, targeted at oftentimes, just in time or very targeted at what that particular learner needs to know, it's much more engaging and relatable. It improves the application. One of the fundamental things we know about learning is that retention rates skyrocket when you have an opportunity to apply that immediately. So you're building the muscle memory of retention as you not only learn about the concept or the protocol or, in our case, the skills or the people or the places that you would need to go to find information in a situation, but actually going through the paces of making those connections allows you to much more effectively apply that when the time comes. And then finally, flexibility and accessibility. One of the things that just fantastic about microlearning is not only the fact that, it's anytime, anywhere, but it reduces the amount of time it takes for individuals to acquire a new skill or new capability. There's also less time invested in creating the curriculum. As we all know, there's a lot of investment that goes into building more sophisticated training curriculum or programs. And not to say that there isn't a place for those sorts of programs. I think that's a really important call out. Looking at what is the proper balance between more comprehensive, it could be in person or it could be multi-day sorts of events versus what can be either stacked on top of those sorts of events or as a standalone that really complements what you're doing in a more traditional setting. So that is just unpacking some of the research behind it. These are just some examples of what we're doing with our customers. You might have seen some of this floating around in some of our blogs recently. But the beauty of what we do with microsimulations, which is a form of microlearning, is that it's extremely versatile. So you can align microsimulations to different regulations and standards. We have a variety that we've done the mapping for you. So it's more about putting together a program that is aligned to your organizational objectives and the things that you've set out to achieve from a regulations and standards perspective. You can integrate it a little each day, or you can apply it on some other cadence, whether it's monthly or quarterly or even yearly, and applying that in such a way that, again, whether it makes sense to integrate it in like bite-sized chunks of here, deploy a single player microsimulation, to a specific audience within your organization, or if you're facilitating, like you're having a town hall and you want to take everyone through a microsimulation together, it really helps you integrate that more holistically and democratize it in such a way that doesn't feel as overwhelming to people, really creating the habit of resilience. So, as you think about, other ways that you might be able to embed that, we do single player and multiplayer capability where people can work independently on microsimulations. This is important from a compliance perspective, as you might imagine, with the reporting aligned to that, or having that capability to deploy in a group workshop. The other thing that we're seeing more frequently is sort of this idea of like paired discussion, right? If you've got a meeting, with another department, sort of walking through some of these scenarios in a very almost like a rip from the headlines sorts of approach, right? How would we tackle this particular situation if it arrived on our doorstep? So this is just an illustration of how microlearning in the form of microsimulations could be deployed across multiple roles in an organization. So in this case, I took the example of one of our deepfake microsimulations and how that can be framed differently depending on your role in the organization. And so whether you're in customer service and working with on the front line with customers that are responding to something that they saw in the news that was concerning to them, or if you're at the executive level, sort of leading the organization through a deepfake attack, really right-sizing your response to those individual roles within the organization. Now, that naturally comes as a part of a group workshop, but I think, as we're seeing, with more and more compliance obligations around the world, ensuring that individuals also have that capability built in and that they're feeling confident that they know essentially how to respond in some of these novel and not so novel situations. So this is a graphic. This one I thought was actually kind of humorous because I can probably relate to all of these things. And the reality is there's never enough time, right? And so this one, just asking you to weigh in with, I think adaptability is something that we all know we need to work on. And I think the reality is like all of our teams really suffer when it comes to, having the tools to be able to respond in disruption or ambiguity or change. These are some of the signs that your team doesn't necessarily have the right tool set to respond in some of those sorts of situations. I think in this particular case, as I wait for others to sort of weigh in here, I think the big piece for me is really around always playing catch up. I think there's always, you're always going to have a sense of urgency around things, but having the foresight to really understand those things that are maybe medium term or longer term that we should be focused on that are ultimately going to impact us in a big way. But yeah, this is interesting. Tech moves faster than policy. Absolutely. I think that's something we're seeing on a much more widespread basis. Struggling to pivot with new threats is another one. The other piece that we're starting to see more emerge more commonly is this element of when to rely on intuition over data. And there was actually some research out of PwC recently. They had done a board survey which indicated that boards are, not surprisingly, focus more on data over intuition when it comes to helping govern organizations. And so there's several reasons behind that, but a big one is just looking to have more grounding in terms of the leading indicators of what's happening. And I think AI, which we're going to get to here in a moment, really enables and empowers us to do that a little differently than we had in the past. Now it's interesting, somebody just weighed in with leadership not prepared. Again, I think this is another scenario where I think leadership teams are starting to get more hands-on, and I think that presents a really unique opportunity for in our domain, really building those bridges and enabling them with the information and the skill set to be able to respond effectively. So this is really very interesting. Thanks for weighing in. I guess as you think about that and kind of how we've looked at that here at Illuminar, looking at, we talk a lot about continuously improving capability. And I guess going back to this particular slide, thinking through how, again, going back to scenario thinking, what are the plausible scenarios, how I might respond to those sorts of events, putting that into practice as if it was actually happening, and then learning from, as we do after action analysis, or what we do at Illuminar is more of a learning loop. Really unpacking that over time to really going back to the PwC research to really understand where your key vulnerabilities are. Massive opportunity. And I think and again, going back to things like microlearning, really empowers you to do that in a much more iterative way, as opposed to doing this once or twice a year with your team, but really making it relevant in the form of both current and like near-term threats, right? And the idea being that like a lot of us have all of this data about plans and procedures and even like our controls and policies and so on and so forth, but we haven't really exercised them in a democratized way, right? There's a lot of assumptions that sit behind that. And so getting people engaging with your data regularly, validating that the data is correct, validating that the things that you based your controls and policies and plans on that are actually still valid. So very important as we continue to experience all this disruption. So that's really as we think about adaptability. It was interesting too, McKinsey came out with some research, and I'll share out some of these links in the follow-up email, whereby they were looking at factors of resilience versus adaptability, because I think there's a difference there in terms of having the skill set to recover, and then having the skill set to adapt, right? And there's an element of learning involved in adaptability that's really important. And not to say that element of learning isn't important in resilience. I mean, that is the virtuous cycle of resilience. But adapting, fundamentally means that the world has changed, right? And the ways in which we operated before are very different than the standard going forward. And so how do we bring everyone else along on that journey with us? But they found that teams that thrived essentially had elements of resilience capability, but then also the ability to move with change, move at the pace of change, which is probably not all that surprising. We're not going to get into a lot of this. I want to make sure we get into the AI piece, but if you want to learn more about just some ways to really make resilience more of a habit, again, like this is in the context of Illuminar. It doesn't have to be Illuminar. You could do this, and you could do this in any way that you would design a bite-sized training program, but ranging anything from weekly microsimulation drills to monthly workshops with your leadership teams to more quarterly or just in time approaches. We also go into more that full scale resilience challenge, and you could do that in the context, it could be town hall, it could be maybe you have like an offsite, multi-day offsite. So yeah, thinking through how you can better integrate that practice, that regular habit of scenario thinking into your team. So definitely check that out. But I do want to get to the stuff with AI, which I think is really very exciting, but also just important to consider as we continue to navigate, all the disruption that we're seeing with AI. We've had a lot of discussions about AI and in many of our webinars. I think the key shift that we're seeing this year already, it was building last year, but I think it really has become much more mainstream this year, at least the talk about it because of some of the newer releases around the OpenAI operator and some of the other capabilities that are available out there, is a move away from AI really as an assistant. We're all familiar with this. We got Siri on our phone or what have you, to something that's much more independent and self-driven with agentic AI. What are the key differences here? For those of you that haven't had a chance to experiment with it, so assistive AI is generally what we know is AI that helps us complete specific tasks. So think of this more as your sidekick, right? It's ChatGPT, having conversations with ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever assistant you're using. It could be the myriad of generated AI products that are available out in the marketplace, but it generally provides support, recommendations. It's a collaborator, right? It's a master of guesswork in the sense that it knows how to ascertain patterns, but essentially it's programmatic, right? It's not necessarily self-driving or independent in the way that you can't give it a task and it can't go out and conduct that task to the extent that agentic AI can. I mean, you can ask ChatGPT or Gemini for that matter, or any number of these systems, like go out and produce an artifact, but agentic AI really has the ability to execute tasks independently based on the context that it learns. And so, this exists today. As I mentioned, there's a huge variety of capabilities already out there in terms of whether it be browser-based agents or self-evolving algorithms, even like more physical representations of this around autonomous drones and other sorts of capability. Robotics is another area that we're seeing this really proliferate. But the idea here being, which I think the ones that I've seen most commonly kind of out and about have been, people experimenting, like buy something off of Amazon or, create a grocery list, from this. So I think, and it's clearly that it's still early days with some of this stuff, but as you might imagine, part of the downside of what we're seeing with agentic AI is that it can be unpredictable. Just as we see generative AI, some of these other applications, it can be somewhat unpredictable. There is an element of bias involved. There's always that potential for unintended consequences. And the fact that we haven't totally figured out the whole ethics piece around AI, and it's becoming more and more independent. So I draw that comparison because I think it's really important in the context of how we build capability around AI. And this has been something that we've been focused on at Illuminar, as you might imagine, just because, that element of preparedness, how do we make sure that we're ready for these novel events that have never really been possible before, right? And so this is sort of the breakdown of the continuum as we move from, what has been in the past more rule-based AI that's really more programmatic and, as we talked about, assistive to something that's much more predictive and self-driving in the sense that it's able to learn and adapt. Now, I think kind of where people are in this continuum, there's a lot of influencing factors. I think the reality and like some of the buzz that we're seeing out in the marketplace are somewhat different, but But I think the key point here being that as technology evolves, ensuring that we're preparing people with the proper, scenario-based training or scenario thinking so that you're getting ahead of these scenarios before they unfold. And so this particular chart breaks down some of the key considerations, in terms of what humans will need to do at each one of these steps. As we move away from the enablement zone, if you will, where AI is supporting us, enabling us to do our jobs more effectively, to AI effectively doing those jobs with our support, right? That human in the loop consideration. It was interesting. I read an article recently that talked about human in the loop, and I think up until now, it has been somewhat of a process whereby we bring AI into a particular use case, right? Like we have a specific task and we may involve AI in that particular task in some capacity, whether it's generative AI or if it's AI more broadly. But I think we're reaching the point where increasingly it'll be about human beings supervising the work of AI, not just in terms of delegating tasks, but also looking at the output, ensuring that that we have the proper controls and governance around what AI is doing. And then also, of course, how do we continue to steer this at all levels of governance, right? Both within the organization and beyond. So with that as a backdrop, we're going to go through, this is the lightning round. So it's a bit of a game. This was super interesting to put together, by the way, because I think like there's just so much that's happening. And I think a lot of us aren't even necessarily thinking about whether AI is doing things or humans are doing things. And so I've got a quick lightning round of questions here, and no cheating, no looking it up, but I'm curious because a lot of these surprise me. If you can correctly guess, or maybe for some of these, whether this was AI or humans. So this first one is going back to 2008. Who first predicted the housing crash? All right, the big reveal. So it was humans. So the majority of you were correct. So this was economist Nouriel Roubini. Hopefully I'm saying his name correctly. He famously warned about the impending collapse before most financial models caught on. And this points to one thing that humans are still really great at is because AI requires an element of pattern matching or pattern finding. When we're dealing with novel situations such as breaking news or some of these emerging risks as we do in our space, sometimes human beings can be best at sensing what is happening, but not always. So that's the first one. All right, next one. 2020. Who first detected a Russian hacking campaign linked to SolarWinds? Was it AI or was it humans? So it was actually AI. It was Microsoft. They have an AI capability that was able to flag this. So again, this is interesting because they were able to detect patterns and effectively flag what was happening on the ground before human analysts were able to piece it together. So super interesting. So 2016, so this is going back a ways, and technology is definitely advanced, but during a Tesla fatal autopilot accident, I think this was the first of its kind, did the car's AI make the final decision to continue driving or was it the human? All right, so it was AI in this case. He was driving on autopilot when the fatal crash occurred. And so the issue in this case was actually that there was a white truck against a bright sky, and the AI failed to recognize the truck in that case, unfortunately. And the driver had placed too much faith in AI, again, like getting to the whole risk management aspect, ensuring we have the proper governance and controls to offset what AI's kind of fatal errors are in that particular case. So very sad story, but in that case, it was AI. Did AI or a human first detect the early warning signs of COVID? This one surprised me. I don't know that this was really even reported all that much, to be honest. Okay, so this was actually, there was a Canadian system, a startup called Blue Dot. They flagged unusual pneumonia cases in Wuhan 9 days before the WHO issued its first alert. So that was interesting. I think there's a lot of work that's going on in this space that kind of remains undetected. So it's interesting that it was able to flag some of that, as I said, like pattern matching before it actually happened. But I think I've got one more. This is more on the strategic side. Did AI or human producers decide to greenlight Netflix's House of Cards based on audience predictions? Right. Those of you guessed that AI, you are correct. It was actually the AI, as you know, Netflix collects all sorts of information about us in our habits. And based on that, Netflix's data analytics showed high engagement with political dramas and Kevin Spacey-led films, leading to a data-led investment or a data-driven decision to invest in that particular series. So super interesting. Thanks for playing along. But I do think that particular game kind of draws the finer point that although there's a lot of buzz in the space, like the reality is like it's human and machine that make up the dream team. And there's certain things that AI clearly excels in, such as pattern matching, being able to look across vast data sets and scaling across even multiple data sets. But human beings really have the edge, at least at this point. I think there's a lot, and maybe in another few months we'll be having a different conversation, I'm not sure. But in terms of understanding the broader context, definitely in novel sorts of situations or those that might be a little ambiguous or tempered with situational, moral, or emotional sorts of factors. There's also some element of thinking long term and that we still have a fundamental edge. And so ensuring that we are able to effectively consider the long-term ramification or even the medium-term ramification of making some of these decisions, again, going back to the importance of doing things like business impact analysis and risk assessment. But although I can do that to some degree, the complexity and the myriad of factors that goes into human decision making, a bit more complex at the moment. And then of course the element of bias, right? I mean, machines are really, at this point, only as good as the data that they're trained on. And this is a major obstacle for many organizations, right? It has been for some time. And so how do we effectively balance, and counter some of the biases that exist in our data and ensure that we're making the right decisions to make different decisions going forward. So with that, and open for questions. I just want to remind everyone, if you want to take a micro simulation home to your team, feel free to scan the QR code and we'll reach out to you. It's a facilitated micro simulation to really bring to life. You can pick from our catalog and bring to life any number of scenarios to your team. But if no one has any questions, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you found it interesting. Definitely enjoyed your insights, and I will see you next time.